Every documentary about Ethel Kennedy tells you she was a stoic widow who held her family together. But there's a book that no profile ever quotes, and the picture it paints is completely different. The book is called The Other Mrs. Kennedy. Jerry Oppenheimer published it in 1994, 521 pages, approximately 400 interviews. And the allegations inside are specific, named, sourced, and systematically ignored by every documentary, profile, and obituary that followed Ethel Kennedy's death in October 2024 at age 96. Here's what the book claims. Behind closed doors at Hickory Hill, the Kennedy compound in McLean, Virginia, there existed a household marked by chaos, neglect, explosive violence, and racist abuse of household staff. Former employees speak on the record. Family insiders describe what they witnessed. The allegations are documented in a book that sits on library shelves across America, available on the Internet Archive for anyone to read. And no one in the documentary industry will touch it. Now, before we go any further, and this matters, Jerry Oppenheimer was an unauthorized biographer. He did not have Kennedy family cooperation. His sources were speaking outside the family's supervision, which cuts both ways. That independence might have given sources freedom to speak honestly, or it might have attracted disgruntled former employees with axes to grind. The book has never been legally challenged by the Kennedy family, a family whose lawyers have aggressively protected their image for generations. The silence from Kennedy Legal is itself interesting. But none of this means Oppenheimer's allegations are proven facts. What it means is they deserve examination, not silence. So let's examine them. The story of Ethel Kennedy doesn't start with Robert Kennedy or with the assassination that made her America's most famous widow. It starts in Greenwich, Connecticut, with a family called the Skakels. This is where Ethel came from. This is the household that shaped her before she ever set foot in the Kennedy orbit. The Skakels were extraordinarily wealthy. George Skakel, Ethel's father, built Great Lakes Carbon Corporation into one of the largest privately held companies in the world, petroleum coke production, an industrial empire. The family had money that most Americans couldn't imagine. But money did not translate into structure. By multiple accounts, the Skakel household was, and this is a direct quote from sources, totally undisciplined and wild. The children ran through their massive Greenwich estate like feral animals. No consistent rules, no bedtimes, no boundaries. The Skakel kids were notorious in their community for behavior that ranged from merely rambunctious to genuinely dangerous. Dinner was served whenever the cook could round up enough children to sit at the table. George Skakel was building his business empire. Anne Skakel was consumed by her social schedule. What parenting existed was delegated to staff who had no real authority to enforce anything. The children learned early. Rules were suggestions. Tantrums worked. Wealth insulated them from consequences. This matters for what came later. Decades after Ethel left Greenwich to marry Robert Kennedy, her nephew, Michael Skakel, the son of her brother Rushton, was convicted for one of the most infamous murders in American history. In 1975, 15-year-old Michael Skakel bludgeoned 15-year-old neighbor Martha Moxley to death with a golf club taken from the Skakel garage. Her body was found on her own property, beaten and stabbed with the broken shaft. The case went unsolved for decades. Investigators would later allege that the Skakel family's wealth and connections allowed them to obstruct the investigation. Michael Skakel was finally convicted in 2002 and spent over a decade in prison. I'm not suggesting genetic determinism. I'm not blaming Ethel for her nephew's crime. But here's the thing. The pattern matters. The chaos that multiple sources allege existed at Hickory Hill was not something Ethel Kennedy learned from the Kennedys. She brought it with her. The Skakel inheritance wasn't just money, it was a particular approach to family life. Children indulged materially, but neglected emotionally. Staff doing the work of parenting while parents enjoyed the status of parenthood. Explosive tempers facing no consequences because wealth insulated the family from accountability. If the allegations in Oppenheimer's book are accurate, Ethel Kennedy recreated the household of her childhood at Hickory Hill. And that brings us to June 5th, 1968. Robert F. Kennedy had just won the California Democratic primary. He was positioned as the frontrunner for the presidential nomination. The Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles was euphoric that night. Ethel stood beside him, pregnant with their 11th child, beaming at the cameras. Minutes later, Sirhan's bullets ended his life in the kitchen corridor. Ethel, who had been steps behind her husband, witnessed the chaos. She knelt beside him, her dress stained with his blood. She became a widow at 40 years old, with 10 children ranging from teenager to toddler, and an 11th on the way. The nation mourned with her. The funeral train from New York to Washington became a national moment of grief, with crowds lining the tracks. Ethel Kennedy entered American mythology that summer as the ultimate tragic figure, young widow, pregnant mother, woman who had lost her husband to the same violence that claimed his brother 5 years before. The standard narrative focuses on her composure, her faith, her refusal to remarry despite 56 years of widowhood that followed. Every profile notes this as evidence of undying devotion. What the standard narrative does not examine is what happened inside the household afterward. According to Oppenheimer's sources, something changed in Ethel Kennedy, or perhaps something that had always been present became worse. The book alleges that following RFK's assassination, Ethel exhibited what sources described as displaced anger directed at her children. Specifically, she reportedly wailed into her older sons, beating Joseph, Bobby Jr., and David with a hairbrush. The violence was allegedly not corrective discipline. It was something closer to rage, lashing out at the boys who reminded her of the husband she'd lost. The older boys bore the physical resemblance to their father. They moved like him, spoke like him, carried his mannerisms, and according to these allegations, their mother punished them for it. Playboy magazine would later describe the pattern. Ethel punished her sons constantly and capriciously, almost as if she blamed them for reminding her of her dead husband. That word capriciously matters. It suggests punishment that struck without warning. A boy might be beaten for an infraction one day and ignored for the same behavior the next. The unpredictability itself became a form of psychological torment. Children who never knew which mother they would encounter, the calm one or the raging one. One source was even more blunt about the treatment of David Kennedy, the fourth son. According to this source, David was despised by his mother, and she didn't really care if he lived or died. She just kind of wanted to banish him from her life. Despised. Banished. These are extraordinary allegations about a mother and son, but they become relevant context for understanding David's trajectory. On the night of his father's assassination, 12-year-old David had been watching the California primary results on television in Malibu. He saw his father claim victory, heard the cheers, then watched in horror as the broadcast captured the aftermath of the shooting. He witnessed his father's assassination in real time, broadcast live into the room where he sat alone. And then, according to these sources, his mother turned against him. A boy who wasn't just traumatized by what he saw, a boy who was allegedly unwanted in his own home afterward. A boy who was banished, that's the word the source uses, rather than comforted. But the allegations don't stop with the children. They extend to the household staff. To understand Hickory Hill, you have to understand the scale. Ethel Kennedy gave birth to 11 children between 1951 and 1968. Kathleen, Joseph, Robert Jr., David, Courtney, Michael, Carrie, Christopher, Matthew, Douglas, and Rory, born 6 months after her father's assassination. Managing 11 children requires an army: nannies, cooks, housekeepers, groundskeepers, secretaries, drivers. Hickory Hill wasn't a family home in the typical sense. It was a 6-acre estate that functioned somewhere between a political salon and an institution. The question of who actually raised those children becomes significant. The 2012 HBO documentary Ethel, directed by Ethel's own daughter Rory, inadvertently provides a clue. In that film, Christopher Kennedy, one of Ethel's sons, discussed the family's nanny and admitted that she would praise us in English and get mad at us in Spanish. Read that again. The nanny handled both the nurturing and the discipline. The emotional labor of raising 11 Kennedy children was delegated to hired staff. The most significant of these was Ina Bernard. She worked for the Kennedys for 44 years. 44 years. According to sources, Bernard served as the emotional anchor for all 11 children. Her primary duties were described as to be a nanny, feed the kids, cook them dinner, change her clothes. That sounds remarkably like the core functions of a parent. Ina Bernard spent 44 years raising Ethel Kennedy's children, while Ethel Kennedy received credit for being their mother. Bernard was there for first words and first steps, for homework struggles and teenage crises, for the daily grinding work of keeping 11 children fed and clothed and emotionally regulated. She was the one who praised them, the one who disciplined them, the emotional anchor, while their actual mother allegedly delivered unpredictable rages and capriciously cruel punishments. Every documentary about Ethel Kennedy shows photographs of her surrounded by her children. None of them show Ina Bernard, the woman who actually did the work. The allegation that Ethel was a mother in title only gains substance here. 11 children, multiple nannies, a 44-year emotional anchor who wasn't their mother. She attended the photo opportunities. She waved from the campaign trail. She accepted the condolences of a nation. But who was putting the children to bed? Who was helping with homework? Who was there when a child woke from a nightmare? According to these accounts, it was the nanny. The staff allegations go beyond mere delegation. According to former Hickory Hill Secretary Noel Fell, Ethel didn't like Hispanics or blacks and would furiously scream and threaten to fire immigrant help if they didn't understand English. Staff members reportedly fled the household in tears or were summarily fired after bearing the brunt of what one source called mad woman screaming. The descriptions paint a picture of a household living in fear, not just the children, but the staff as well. The rages could erupt without warning, triggered by minor errors or misunderstandings. Consequences were severe. The most inflammatory allegation comes from actor Peter Lawford. He was married to Patricia Kennedy, JFK and RFK's sister, and thus had an insider's view of family dynamics. Lawford reportedly witnessed Ethel using a racial slur against an African-American maid, screaming, "You stupid," and I'll leave the word to your imagination. "Don't you know what you're doing? Get out of my sight. You're fired." Lawford was not a disgruntled former employee. He was a member of the family by marriage. He was in the inner circle. And according to him, he witnessed Ethel Kennedy using racist language and summarily firing a black employee. The book alleges that Ethel delivered uncontrollable blackout rages, directed at both her household staff and her own children. The phrase blackout rages suggests something beyond ordinary anger, a loss of control so complete that the person experiencing it may not fully remember their own actions. These rages allegedly struck unpredictably. The household would be calm one moment and chaotic the next. Staff learned to walk on eggshells. Children learned to make themselves invisible. And the nanny, 44-year Ina Bernard, served as the emotional anchor, the one stable presence in a household defined by instability. So what happened to the children? This is where allegations meet outcomes. This is where theory meets evidence. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. began a 14-year heroin addiction at the age of 15, just 3 months after his father's assassination. 3 months. While the nation was still mourning, while the family was supposedly pulling together. A 15-year-old boy started using heroin. Whatever was happening inside that household in the summer of 1968, it was not providing Bobby Jr. with the support he needed to process trauma. RFK Jr. has spoken publicly about his childhood. His own words are revealing. He has stated that his mother invented tough love, a disciplinary approach that left him feeling emptiness and loneliness during his youth. Invented tough love. That phrase is striking. It suggests not discipline but emotional withdrawal. A mother who withheld the nurturing her children needed. Emptiness. Loneliness. A mother who withdrew rather than engaged. 14 years of heroin addiction. Bobby Jr. didn't get clean until he was almost 30 years old. More than a decade of his young adulthood consumed by addiction. A decade that coincided with his mother's alleged combination of emotional withdrawal and explosive rages. He survived, got clean, became an environmental lawyer, and eventually a controversial public figure. But the fact that he began using heroin at 15, 3 months after his father's assassination, while living in his mother's household, that raises questions no documentary has been willing to ask. And then there's David. David Kennedy is the most tragic story. 12 years old when he watched his father's assassination on live television, struggled with substance abuse throughout his adolescence and young adulthood. According to the source who spoke to Oppenheimer, he was despised by his mother, who didn't really care if he lived or died, and wanted to banish him from her life. David Kennedy died of a drug overdose in Palm Beach, Florida, in 1984. He was 28 years old. The substances that killed him included cocaine, Demerol, and other drugs. He died alone in a hotel room. A boy who watched his father murdered on television at 12. A boy who was allegedly despised and banished by his surviving parent. A boy who turned to drugs and never found his way out. One troubled child could be individual tragedy. 2 could be coincidence, but the pattern extends further. Michael Kennedy, another son, became embroiled in scandal over an alleged affair with his children's teenage babysitter, a relationship that allegedly began when the girl was 14. Joseph Kennedy II faced public controversy over his aggressive pursuit of an annulment from his first wife. The phrase that appears in multiple accounts is that the sons were undisciplined rogues. A pattern across multiple children suggests systemic household dysfunction, not just bad luck, not just tragedy. Something in how that household functioned. So why doesn't any documentary mention this? The 2012 HBO documentary Ethel was directed by Rory Kennedy, Ethel's youngest child, born after her father's assassination. It is, by definition, a family production. The family participated, the family provided access, the family shaped the narrative. And the documentary presented exactly what you'd expect from a film made by a daughter about her mother. A loving portrait of a woman who overcame tragedy with grace. Oppenheimer's book goes unmentioned. This is the pattern throughout Kennedy documentary coverage. The family grants interviews. The family provides home movies. The family shares photographs. And in exchange, the documentarians agree, explicitly or implicitly, not to ask about the book that no one discusses. Access is the currency, and the price of access is silence. Oppenheimer's book exists. It sits in libraries. It's been reviewed and cited. Yet when profile after profile is produced about Ethel Kennedy, especially after her death, that book is conspicuously absent. The documentary industry has made a collective editorial decision. Certain documented allegations do not merit examination. Certain questions will not be asked. Certain books will not be quoted. I want to be clear about what I'm doing here. This is not a conviction. Jerry Oppenheimer's book is an unauthorized biography with credibility debates attached. The sources may have had grudges. The allegations may be exaggerated or distorted or simply wrong. But that's exactly the point. We don't know. We've never been allowed to examine the evidence in a mainstream documentary context. The industry decided for us that these allegations weren't worth investigating, that the hagiographic version, stoic widow, devoted mother, tragic figure, was the only version the public should see. The children who grew up in that household, the ones who became addicts, who died young, who struggled publicly, were never asked about the allegations in that book on camera. The staff who allegedly witnessed the rages were never interviewed for a major documentary. The pattern of outcomes, multiple children with substance abuse, behavioral problems, early deaths, was never examined as evidence of household dysfunction. Instead, we got photographs of touch football games, glamorous gatherings at Hickory Hill, celebrity visitors. The mythology of Camelot extended to a widow who, according to at least one extensively researched book, may have been something very different behind closed doors. Ethel Kennedy died in October 2024 at 96 years old. The obituaries were kind. The tributes were warm. The documentaries that followed her death told the same story they've always told. And the book that no one quotes still sits in libraries across America. The question isn't whether Ethel Kennedy was guilty of everything alleged in that book. The question is why we were never allowed to examine the allegations. Why the documentary industry closed ranks around an image and refused to investigate claims that, if made about someone without the Kennedy name, would merit at least journalistic scrutiny. What does it mean that we canonize figures before examining them? And what did that canonization cost the children who lived with the reality? Subscribe for more stories like this.